Berlin, July 20th, 1944. The sound of steel-tipped boots echoed against stone walls like a countdown to history's judgment. In a Nazi prison cell where shadows danced like harbingers of fate, Count Heinrich von Lehndorff-Steinort stood beneath a single yellow bulb that swung with each footstep of his approaching executioner. His face remained composed with aristocratic dignity, the same ethereal calm that would later define every photograph his daughter would ever pose for. The gunshot that ended his life was not just the execution of a man. It was the birth of a different kind of legend. The bullet that silenced his voice would echo through decades, teaching his 4-year-old daughter the most dangerous lesson any child could learn. That survival meant mastering the art of disappearance, that visibility could be fatal, and that sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to ensure the living became impossible to find. The child who would become Veruschka von Lehndorff learned her father's final lesson, before she could understand its meaning. That some forms of courage are rewarded only with erasure, that standing up can lead to lying down forever, and that the safest way to exist might be to become so thoroughly someone else that your authentic self could never be targeted, captured, or destroyed by the forces that reshape history, according to their own visions of acceptable reality. The child who would become Veruschka von Lehndorff was 4 years old when her father was murdered for choosing morality over survival, principle over pragmatism. But the trauma of that loss would not reveal itself in tears or obvious grief. Instead, it would manifest as a lifelong compulsion to erase herself, to transform personal pain into impersonal beauty, to become so thoroughly absorbed into artistic creation that the wounded girl inside could finally achieve the invisibility that might have saved her father's life. "I became a canvas, not just a model," she would later say. But the transformation had begun long before she ever stood before a camera. It started in that prison cell where her father learned that some forms of courage are rewarded only with death, and continued through a childhood where survival required learning to become whatever version of herself would keep her family safe from the political forces that had already destroyed their world once, and might do so again at any moment. The woman who would revolutionize fashion photography by literally disappearing into landscapes, who would use body paint and artistic vision to become rocks, trees, sand dunes, and abstract patterns, was already practicing the art of camouflage before she could properly spell her own name. The little girl who had lost her father to history's judgment was learning that visibility could be dangerous, that standing out could be fatal, and that sometimes the safest way to exist was to become so thoroughly something else that your authentic self could never be targeted, captured, or destroyed. But the same psychological mechanism that protected her from trauma would also trap her in a career that demanded she become everyone except herself, that celebrated her ability to transform while never acknowledging the person who was performing those transformations. Each photograph would be both artistic achievement and act of self-erasure, each successful pose another step away from the possibility of authentic human connection or genuine emotional healing. As her career reached heights that previous generations of models had never imagined possible, one question haunted every image. Was Veruschka disappearing into art to achieve immortality, or was she simply perfecting the most sophisticated method of suicide ever devised? Death by 1,000 beautiful erasures, each more complete than the last. To understand how a Prussian aristocrat's daughter became fashion's most enigmatic figure, we must first journey back to the rubble of post-war Germany, where a traumatized child learned that transformation was not just artistic technique but survival strategy, and that sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to ensure the living became impossible to find. In the devastated landscape of post-war Germany, where ancient castles lay in ruins and noble families scrambled to rebuild lives that history had shattered beyond recognition, Vera von Lehndorff grew up carrying the double burden of her father's martyrdom and his betrayal of the state that had claimed to represent German honor. The Count's execution had marked his family not just as grief-stricken but as politically suspect, bearers of a legacy that was simultaneously heroic and treasonous depending on who was writing the official narrative. The children of the July 20th conspirators formed their own invisible community of historical orphans, bound together by shared experience of losing parents to conscience, while being raised by survivors who had to navigate the complex psychology of mourning heroes who were also criminals in the eyes of the law. Each family gathering was both memorial service and survival strategy session, as relatives discussed how to honor the dead while protecting the living from the social ostracism that could follow anyone too closely associated with the failed assassination plot. This was the atmosphere that taught Vera her most essential skill, the ability to disappear in plain sight, to be present without being visible, to exist without drawing the kind of attention that might remind powerful people of inconvenient truths about recent history. Where her father had died for daring to stand straight against tyranny, she learned to lie down and blend into whatever background seemed safest, mastering the art of camouflage long before she ever encountered a camera or a can of body paint. Her body became the only territory where she could exercise complete control, the only battlefield where the strategies that had failed her father might prove successful for his daughter. Where he had used words and weapons to fight history, she would use flesh and beauty to transcend it, transforming the same aristocratic bearing that had made him visible to his enemies into an aesthetic weapon that would make her simultaneously famous and invisible, everywhere in the images and nowhere in the reality that created them. The aristocratic heritage that should have provided stability and privilege instead became a burden of historical guilt and social suspicion. Each family heirloom that survived the war was both treasured connection to better times and reminder of a world that no longer existed, a social order that had produced both her father's moral courage and the political circumstances that made such courage a death sentence. The mother who raised Vera after her father's execution was herself a victim of historical forces beyond her control, struggling to provide emotional support while processing her own trauma from losing a husband to political idealism that had seemed noble in theory but proved catastrophic in practice. Each bedtime story was both expression of love and lesson in the dangers of standing up for principles that powerful people found threatening. The childhood that should have been filled with typical aristocratic pursuits, horseback riding, language lessons, cultural education, was instead dominated by practical concerns about survival, adaptation, and the constant need to prove loyalty to whatever political authority currently held power. Each day required navigating between honoring her father's memory and demonstrating that she posed no threat to the people who had ordered his death. Could these early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? The evidence was written in every photograph she would later create, which combined aristocratic bearing with profound emotional distance, inherited elegance with studied alienation from normal human relationships. The girl who learned to survive by becoming invisible was developing skills that would later make her invaluable to photographers seeking models who could embody mystery, sophistication, and the kind of otherworldly beauty that seemed to exist independent of ordinary human desires or needs. School provided both refuge and additional challenge, as Vera struggled to fit in with classmates who had not experienced the particular form of historical trauma that shaped her family's existence. Each friendship required careful navigation between normal teenage concerns and the awareness that her family name carried associations with events that most people preferred not to discuss or remember. The artistic interests that began to emerge during her adolescence were both creative outlet and continuation of the disappearing act she had been practicing since childhood. Each drawing, Each sculpture, each experiment with visual aesthetics was both expression of inherited artistic sensibility and method of transforming personal pain into impersonal beauty that could be shared without revealing the emotional costs of its creation. The modeling career that began almost accidentally when she was discovered in her early 20s was both escape from post-war Germany's limitations and entrance into a new form of performance that would allow her to perfect the techniques of self-erasure she had been developing since childhood. The photographers who saw potential in her unusual height, angular features, and mysterious presence were offering something that traditional aristocratic life could never provide: the possibility of transforming her difference into asset rather than liability. But the same qualities that made her attractive to fashion photographers also made her vulnerable to an industry that had no interest in the historical trauma that had shaped her aesthetic sensibility. No understanding of the psychological costs of the transformations they were asking her to perform, and no concern for the long-term emotional welfare of someone whose value was entirely dependent on her willingness to become whatever fantasy their cameras required. The transformation from Vera von Lehndorff to Veruschka was both practical necessity and symbolic rebirth, as the young woman carrying the weight of her father's martyrdom reinvented herself as someone who could transcend national boundaries, historical associations, and the particular burden of being connected to Germany's recent past. The new name was both liberation and erasure, freeing her from political associations while also separating her from family history that had shaped her understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible costs that moral stands could exact from the people brave enough to take them. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The evidence was accumulating in Veruschka's increasing skill at emotional dissociation, her growing ability to exist in front of cameras while remaining completely absent from the experience of being photographed. Each successful shoot was both artistic achievement and step further away from any possibility of authentic self-knowledge or genuine human connection. The early assignments that brought her to international attention were both breakthrough opportunities and education in how thoroughly the fashion industry could exploit psychological vulnerabilities that models were not encouraged to acknowledge or address. Each magazine cover, each advertising campaign, each collaboration with legendary photographers was both career milestone and evidence that her trauma was being transformed into commercial asset that generated wealth and recognition for everyone except the person whose pain made such transformation possible. Behind all that apparent glamour and artistic achievement, was there already a young woman discovering that the skills that made her valuable to photographers were also making it impossible for her to form authentic relationships or experience genuine emotions that were not filtered through the lens of how they might be used to create more compelling images? The move to Paris and New York in the mid-1960s represented both artistic expansion and cultural displacement, as Veruschka discovered that international modeling required even more sophisticated forms of self-erasure than she had developed in Germany. The fashion capitals that embraced her as an exotic newcomer also established expectations about her availability for whatever transformations photographers might envision. Her willingness to embody any aesthetic concept regardless of personal comfort or emotional cost. The 1967 Vogue cover that transformed Vera von Lehndorff into Veruschka was both career pinnacle and final disappearance, as the image that established her as fashion's most enigmatic figure also completed the erasure that had begun in childhood. The photograph captured something unprecedented in fashion photography. Not just beauty, but the aesthetic representation of historical trauma transformed into visual poetry. Her eyes held the same distant composure that her father had maintained before his execution, the same aristocratic detachment that had been bred into Prussian nobility for generations. But this was no longer about survival or politics. This was about perfecting the art of disappearance until it became its own form of immortality. Each successful photograph was both artistic achievement and another degree of vanishing. Each pose another step away from whatever remained of Vera von Lehndorff toward the complete becoming of Veruschka, a creature who existed only when cameras were watching, who had no authentic existence beyond her capacity to embody other people's artistic visions. The body painting experiments that followed were the logical conclusion of a lifetime spent learning to erase herself. In the desert photo shoots where she became indistinguishable from sand dunes, her body finally achieved what her childhood trauma had demanded: perfect camouflage, complete invisibility, the ultimate mastery of disappearing in plain sight. The photographers who captured these images exclaimed over the artistry, but the woman beneath the paint understood that she was not creating art. She was perfecting suicide, one beautiful erasure at a time. Each transformation into rocks, trees, abstract patterns was both technical marvel and philosophical statement about what happened to human beings who learned too well the lesson that visibility was dangerous. Her body had become both canvas and grave, the site where personal history was buried beneath layers of aesthetic achievement that concealed the woman who had made such achievement possible through systematic self-destruction disguised as artistic innovation. The fashion industry that celebrated her breakthrough was also establishing the terms of her artistic imprisonment, as each successful collaboration created expectations about her continued willingness to push boundaries, take risks, and transform herself in ways that more conventional models might refuse to attempt. The same fearlessness that made her valuable also made her vulnerable to photographers who understood that her childhood trauma had taught her to prioritize other people's artistic visions over her own safety or emotional welfare. The collaborations with legendary photographers like Richard Avedon and Irving Penn during the late 1960s were both artistic education and psychological manipulation disguised as creative partnership. These men understood something about Veruschka that she was only beginning to comprehend herself, that her childhood trauma had created a perfect subject for their cameras, someone who had already learned to disappear on command, to become whatever vision they required while asking no questions about the emotional costs of such transformations. Avedon in particular recognized the quality that made her irreplaceable, not just her unusual beauty or aristocratic bearing, but her capacity for what he called aesthetic suicide. Her willingness to die a little in each photograph in order to create images that transcended ordinary fashion photography. Their sessions were less like traditional modeling shoots than psychological experiments, as he pushed her to access increasingly profound states of dissociation, teaching her to use her trauma as an artistic tool rather than seeking to heal from it. The famous desert series that emerged from these collaborations was both the pinnacle of their artistic partnership and evidence of how thoroughly she had learned to weaponize her own psychological vulnerabilities. Each image showed her body transformed into landscape elements: sand, stone, shadow, but also documented the systematic erasure of whatever remained of Vera von Lehndorff beneath the artistic persona of Veruschka. The photographers celebrated these images as revolutionary achievements in fashion art. She experienced them as practice sessions for her own disappearance. Irving Penn's approach was different but equally exploitative, as he understood that her aristocratic training had taught her to prioritize other people's needs over her own, to find meaning through service rather than self-expression. His portraits of her were masterpieces of psychological portraiture that captured not just her beauty but the existential emptiness that was beginning to consume whatever authentic personality had survived her childhood and early career. Each sitting was both artistic collaboration and documentation of someone who was learning to exist primarily as other people's creative vision, rather than as an independent human being. But perhaps most troubling was her growing awareness that these legendary photographers valued her precisely because of the psychological damage that made her so compliant, so willing to transform herself in ways that more psychologically healthy models might refuse to attempt. The same trauma that had taught her to disappear as a survival mechanism was now being celebrated as artistic gift, transformed from personal wound into commercial asset that generated wealth and recognition for everyone except the person whose pain made such recognition possible. The body painting experiments that would define her ultimate artistic legacy began as attempts to push beyond the limitations of traditional fashion photography. But they quickly revealed themselves as the logical conclusion of a lifetime spent learning to erase herself. The first attempts were relatively simple, geometric patterns that enhanced her natural features while maintaining recognizable human form. But as her skill and confidence grew, the transformations became more radical, more complete, more devastating in their psychological implications. The process itself was both meditative and traumatic, requiring hours of patient application during which she had to remain perfectly still while artists painted away her recognizable features, her individual characteristics, everything that might identify her as a specific person rather than an abstract artistic concept. Each brushstroke was both creative act and small death, each layer of paint another barrier between her authentic self and the world that was paying to observe her transformation. The most famous images from this period show her becoming indistinguishable from natural environments, her body painted to match desert sand so perfectly that only her eyes remained visible, her form camouflaged against rocks and trees with such precision that viewers had to search the photographs to locate her presence. These were celebrated as revolutionary achievements in body art, proof that fashion photography could transcend commercial limitations to become genuine artistic expression. But for Veruschka herself, these sessions represented the perfection of techniques she had been developing since childhood, the ultimate refinement of survival mechanisms that had protected her from historical trauma. By teaching her to become invisible, the artists who collaborated on these projects understood that they were documenting something unprecedented in fashion history, but they had no comprehension of the psychological costs being paid by the woman whose body served as their canvas. The critical acclaim that greeted these images was both validation of her artistic vision and evidence that her trauma had been successfully transformed into aesthetic achievement that could be appreciated without understanding its origins or costs. Each review that praised her innovation, each museum exhibition that displayed her transformations, each academic analysis of her contribution to fashion art was also documentation of someone who had learned to find meaning only through systematic self-destruction disguised as creative expression. The isolation that accompanied her artistic success was both consequence and cause of her growing disconnection from normal human relationships, as she discovered that the skills that made her valuable to photographers were also making it impossible to form authentic connections with people who might see her as more than just a vehicle for their creative visions. Each successful collaboration was evidence of her growing ability to exist as pure artistic medium, but also of her decreasing capacity for the kind of emotional vulnerability that intimate relationships required. The interviews she gave during this period revealed someone who was attempting to articulate experiences that extended far beyond conventional fashion industry narratives, but also someone who was losing the ability to distinguish between the artistic personas she created and whatever authentic personality might still exist beneath all the transformations she had undergone. Her responses to questions about her work became increasingly abstract, philosophical, disconnected from the practical realities of human existence or emotional experience. Salvador Dali's famous declaration that she was the living embodiment of surrealist beauty was both recognition of her artistic achievements and inadvertent acknowledgement that she had transcended ordinary human existence in ways that might not be sustainable or psychologically healthy. The same qualities that made her valuable to surrealist artists, her capacity for transformation, her comfort with dissolution of normal identity boundaries, her willingness to exist primarily as aesthetic object, were also symptoms of psychological dissociation that had never been addressed or treated as anything other than professional assets. The body painting experiments that would later define her artistic legacy began during this period as attempts to push the boundaries of what modeling could accomplish. But they also represented the logical conclusion of a lifetime spent learning to erase herself in service of other people's visions. Each transformation into rocks, trees, sand, or abstract patterns was both artistic breakthrough and perfect metaphor for someone who had been disappearing by degrees since childhood, someone who had learned that visibility was dangerous and invisibility was the ultimate form of protection. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The fame that should have provided security and validation instead created new forms of pressure, as Veruschka discovered that being recognized as fashion's most innovative model also meant being expected to constantly surpass her previous achievements, to find new ways of disappearing that were more complete, more artistic, more commercially viable than anything she had accomplished before. Behind all that artistic innovation and critical acclaim, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The evidence was mounting in her increasing isolation from normal social relationships, her growing difficulty distinguishing between the artistic personas she created for cameras and whatever authentic personality might still exist beneath all those layers of transformation and performance. The 1970s brought both the pinnacle of her artistic achievement and the beginning of her retreat from commercial fashion, as Veruschka began to understand that the industry that had celebrated her innovations was also consuming the person who made those innovations possible. The body painting collaborations that produced her most famous images were both artistic triumph and final surrender, as she discovered ways of disappearing so completely that the line between Veruschka and her artistic transformations ceased to exist. The desert photo shoots where she became indistinguishable from sand dunes and rock formations represented the ultimate evolution of techniques she had been developing since childhood, but they also marked the point where artistic transformation became existential crisis. The woman who had learned to survive by becoming invisible had achieved such complete mastery of disappearance that she was no longer certain whether there was anything left to disappear. The critical acclaim that greeted these images was both validation of her artistic vision and evidence that her trauma had been successfully transformed into aesthetic achievement that other people could appreciate without understanding the psychological costs of its creation. Each review that praised her ability to transcend the limitations of traditional modeling was also acknowledgement that she had sacrificed conventional human existence for the sake of becoming something unprecedented and possibly unsustainable. The fashion industry's response to her artistic evolution was both celebration and abandonment, as editors and photographers who had once competed for her attention began to find her increasingly difficult to work with. Too committed to her own artistic vision to be easily manipulated into serving their commercial purposes. The same integrity that made her work memorable also made her less valuable to clients who preferred models who would conform to their creative concepts rather than insisting on collaborative artistic development. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? The psychological isolation that had begun as protection against historical trauma was becoming its own form of imprisonment, as Veruschka discovered that the skills that had made her valuable as an artist were also making authentic human relationships nearly impossible to develop or maintain. Each successful transformation was evidence of her growing disconnection from normal emotional experiences, her increasing dependence on artistic creation as the only meaningful form of self-expression available to her. The retreat from commercial fashion that characterized Veruschka's later career was both artistic choice and psychological necessity. as she began to understand that the industry that had celebrated her innovations was also systematically consuming whatever remained of her authentic identity. The body art projects that continued to occupy her attention after her withdrawal from mainstream modeling were both creative outlet and form of therapy. Though she seemed unaware that what she was calling artistic exploration might actually be symptoms of profound psychological dissociation that had never been properly addressed. The reclusive lifestyle that she adopted in her Berlin apartment was both protective measure and evidence of how thoroughly she had lost the ability to exist in normal social situations without the mediating presence of cameras, artistic concepts, or some other framework that would allow her to be present without actually being visible as herself. The few visitors who were admitted to her private space described an environment that seemed more like an art installation than a living space. Walls covered with images from her fashion career, workspaces dedicated to painting and sculpture, but few signs of normal human habitation or comfort. The cats that became her primary companions during this period provided the kind of uncomplicated relationship that she had learned to prefer over human connections, that might require emotional availability or authentic self-revelation. Each animal was both source of comfort and reminder of how far she had traveled from the possibility of intimate human relationships that might demand she exist as someone rather than as no one, as Vera rather than as Veruschka, as a person rather than as an artistic concept. The interviews she granted during this period became increasingly rare and abstract, as she struggled to find language that could explain experiences that extended beyond normal human categories of identity, relationship, and emotional development. Each conversation revealed someone who was intellectually brilliant, but emotionally unreachable. Someone who could discuss philosophical concepts of identity and transformation with sophisticated insight while seeming completely disconnected from the practical realities of human existence. The art she created during her withdrawal from fashion was both continuation of her lifelong interest in transformation and evidence of how thoroughly she had internalized the lessons of disappearance that her childhood trauma had taught her. The paintings and sculptures that filled her apartment were abstract explorations of presence and absence, visibility and invisibility, individual identity and universal artistic expression. Themes that had defined her entire life but that she seemed to approach as intellectual problems rather than personal experiences. But perhaps most troubling was her apparent inability to distinguish between the artistic exploration of identity dissolution and the actual psychological experience of dissociation that had been her primary coping mechanism since childhood. The same techniques that had made her valuable to fashion photographers were now being celebrated as avant-garde artistic practice. But nobody seemed to recognize that what was being called creative innovation might actually be symptoms of trauma that had never been properly treated or even acknowledged as problematic. The few friends who maintained contact with her during this period described someone who seemed to exist primarily in the past tense, as if her present-day life was less real than the images that continued to circulate through fashion museums and art galleries around the world. Each conversation would inevitably return to analysis of her photographic work, discussion of its artistic significance, speculation about its influence on contemporary fashion, but rarely any engagement with questions about her current emotional state, her relationships, or her plans for a future that extended beyond managing the archive of her past achievements. The health problems that began to emerge during her later years were both consequences of decades of extreme physical demands and symptoms of psychological stress that had never been properly addressed. The body that had been transformed into art so many times had also been subjected to forms of punishment and neglect that were now manifesting as chronic pain, mobility limitations, and other medical issues that could not be resolved through artistic transformation or aesthetic achievement. But even these physical challenges were approached through the lens of artistic exploration rather than practical medical care, as if her body remained primarily a vehicle for creative expression rather than a human organism that required attention, care, and conventional forms of healing that had nothing to do with cameras or artistic vision. Each medical appointment became another opportunity to discuss the relationship between physical transformation and aesthetic achievement, rather than addressing the basic health needs of someone whose body had been treated as artistic medium for so many years that its basic biological requirements had been systematically ignored. The critical recognition that followed her career was both validation of her contributions to fashion history and reminder that her artistic achievements had been built on forms of self-sacrifice that most people would find unacceptable. Each retrospective exhibition, each academic analysis of her influence on fashion photography, each celebration of her artistic innovations was also documentation of someone who had learned to transform personal trauma into public art at costs that were never fully calculated or acknowledged. The interviews she gave during this period revealed someone who was attempting to articulate experiences that extended far beyond conventional fashion industry narratives. Someone who understood that her career had been both artistic triumph and extended performance of disappearance that had lasted so long. She was no longer certain what might exist beneath all the transformations she had undergone. To disappear in art is to become eternal, she had said, but the statement raised uncomfortable questions about whether eternal artistic existence was adequate compensation for the sacrifice of temporal human experience. Whether becoming immortal through images was worth the cost of never learning to exist authentically as herself rather than as someone else's creative vision. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? The artistic projects that occupied her attention during her withdrawal from commercial fashion were both creative expression and attempts to understand what remained of her original identity after decades of professional transformation. Whether it was possible to recover authentic selfhood after spending a lifetime perfecting techniques of artistic self-erasure. The legacy she left behind was both inspiring and cautionary, proof that models could transcend the limitations of their profession to become genuine artists, while also demonstrating the psychological costs that such transcendence might exact from people whose childhood experiences had already taught them that survival required constant adaptation to other people's expectations and needs. Today, decades after her retreat from commercial fashion, Veruschka's images continue to haunt galleries and fashion museums like beautiful ghosts that refuse to be buried by time or changing aesthetic preferences. But her legacy raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between artistic achievement and psychological survival, between creating beauty and maintaining humanity, between honoring trauma and being consumed by it. She had achieved exactly what she set out to accomplish. She had learned to disappear so completely that she became eternal, transformed personal pain into impersonal beauty that would outlast memory, persecution, and even death itself. The little girl who had learned to vanish as protection against historical forces that had killed her father had grown into an artist who made disappearance itself into a form of beauty that transcended the circumstances that had made such beauty necessary. But the price of immortality through art was the sacrifice of everything that makes immortality meaningful. Authentic relationships, genuine emotions, the messy complications of ordinary human existence that provide the context within which artistic achievement becomes personally, rather than simply professionally significant. Veruschka had succeeded in becoming an image rather than a person, but images cannot love or be loved, cannot grow or change or learn from their experiences in ways that might heal the wounds that created them. "I never wanted to be a star," she had said in one of her final interviews. "I wanted to be an image." The wish had been granted more completely than she could have anticipated, transforming her into something that would influence fashion photography for decades, while ensuring that the person who made such influence possible would remain as mysterious and unknowable as the artistic transformations that had made her famous. Veruschka had perfected the art of disappearing, achieving through aesthetic mastery what her father's political courage had failed to accomplish. A form of existence that could not be destroyed by historical forces because it had already transcended the boundaries between life and death, presence and absence, individual identity and universal artistic expression. She had become simultaneously everywhere in the cultural imagination and nowhere in the human relationships that give cultural achievement its meaning. The art of disappearing, practiced from childhood and perfected over decades of professional transformation, had achieved its ultimate goal, making her immortal through images while ensuring that immortality would be experienced as the most sophisticated form of suicide ever devised. She had died by 1,000 beautiful erasures, each more complete than the last, until nothing remained except the photographs and the questions they raised about whether such beauty was worth the human cost of its creation. In the end, Veruschka had accomplished what perhaps no other model in history had achieved. She had proven that fashion could be art, that bodies could be canvases, that disappearance itself could become a form of aesthetic achievement. But she had also demonstrated that some forms of artistic transcendence might require sacrificing the very humanity that makes artistic expression meaningful in the first place. The Count's daughter, who had learned to vanish as protection against the forces that had murdered her father for his visibility, had ultimately achieved such complete mastery of invisibility that she became a kind of artistic ghost, present in every museum that displayed fashion photography, absent from the normal human experiences that give artistic recognition its personal significance. She had honored her father's memory by ensuring that she could never be captured or destroyed by political enemies, but the same protective disappearance had also made it impossible for her to be reached by people who might have offered love, understanding, or genuine human connection. Veruschka had done what she set out to do, disappear in order to become eternal. But the price of eternity was everything that had once made existence worth preserving. The woman who became a canvas rather than just a model had created images that would outlast anyone who remembered her as a human being rather than an artistic phenomenon, proving that immortality through art was possible but might be indistinguishable from the most beautiful death imaginable.